And that concludes our theoretical overview of Deathworld physiology, Professor Zylox Zarn announced, his gelatinous form rippling with what passed for excitement among his species, the globins. His multiple eye stalks twitched as he surveyed the class. Any questions before we move on to the practical demonstration? A tentacle shot up from the back of the room. It belonged to Gorp, the class clown and well-known troublemaker. Yeah, Prof, when are we going to see some real action? Gorp asked with a sneer. I mean, come on, these Deathworlders can't be as tough as you say, right? They're probably just a bunch of squishy losers who got lucky with evolution. The class erupted in a cacophony of alien laughter. Chittering, gurgling, and strange squeaking sounds filled the room like a broken sitcom laugh track. Professor Zarn's gelatinous skin flushed a deep violet, a sign of both annoyance and slight embarrassment. I assure you, Gorp. Zarn replied coolly, Deathworlders are not to be underestimated. Their home planet, Earth, is a nightmarish place of environmental extremes, deadly predators, and constant planetary upheavals. The fact that they not only survived but thrived in such conditions is a testament to their resilience. Just then, the classroom door swished open, and in lumbered the subject of their discussion, Ethan Ryder, the only human exchange student at Galactic University. Ethan ducked to avoid hitting his head on the doorframe again and shuffled awkwardly to his desk. Sorry I'm late, Professor Ethan muttered, his face flushing red. I had a little accident in the cafeteria. Professor Zarn's eye stalks swiveled toward Ethan, taking in the disheveled state of the human. Good gracious, Mr. Ryder, what happened to you? Ethan chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of his head. Well, I was trying to get some of that Centurion plasma jelly, but the dispenser was jammed. I gave it a little tap, and the whole thing exploded. Turns out that plasma jelly doesn't mix too well with human skin oils. The class fell silent as they took in Ethan's appearance. His skin was dotted with small red welts, and thin wisps of smoke were still rising from his singed eyebrows. Gorp snickered and couldn't resist taking another shot. Hey, some invincible Deathworlder you are, taken down by a dessert. Maybe we should rename your species Jellyworlders. Before Ethan could respond, he hurriedly tried to pull out his reinforced alloy chair, but misjudging his own strength, he yanked it too hard. The chair went flying across the room and embedded itself in the wall with a loud clang, landing just inches from Gorp's startled form. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the faint tink, 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 tink of the chair, slowly working its way out of the wall and falling to the floor. Oops, Ethan mumbled, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. Professor Zarn's gelatinous body pulsed, a clear sign of distress. Class, he said, his tone shifting to the manic enthusiasm of a mad scientist, I believe we've found our volunteer for today's practical demonstration. Mr. Ryder, if you would please. Ethan's eyes widened. Demonstration. What demonstra? Before he could finish his question, a transparent force field bubble formed around him, lifting him off the ground. Hey! What's happening? Ethan yelped, flailing his limbs as the gravity in the bubble disappeared, leaving him floating awkwardly. Now, Class Professor Zarn began, rubbing his tentacles together in excitement. We shall observe how a Deathworlder responds to various environmental stresses. Let's begin with something simple, shall we? Computer, initiate Scenario 1 radiation survival test. The bubble around Ethan began to glow faintly, shifting in color from blue to an ominous green. Professor? What's going on now? Ethan asked nervously, feeling the skin on his arms begin to tingle. We're gradually increasing the levels of cosmic radiation inside the bubble, Mr. Ryder. Professor Zarn explained, watching closely. Radiation levels that would normally incapacitate most species. Let's see how your physiology adapts. Ethan's skin began to flush pink, and his hair stood on end as the radiation levels increased. His body buzzed with an unpleasant tingling sensation. I don't feel so great, he muttered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. The class watched in stunned silence, their various eyes and appendages locked onto Ethan as the radiation levels continued to rise. One of the students raised an eye stalk to ask a question, but Professor Zarn was too engrossed in his observations to notice. Fascinating, the professor muttered to himself, his eye stalks darting from Ethan to the computer's readout. His body is absorbing the radiation and adapting far more quickly than anticipated. Observe how his cells are compensating for the damage. Inside the bubble, Ethan felt like a baked potato in a microwave. Professor, I really feel like this might be pushing it a bit, he said weakly, his skin turning an odd shade of red. Before Professor Zarn could respond, Gorp's mocking voice cut through the tension. "Ha! Looks like your Deathworlder is about to melt. Should we get the butter ready?" But Gorp's taunting was once again cut short as Ethan, struggling to regain his balance, accidentally kicked off the bubble wall, sending himself flying across the room. His body slammed into the force field's edge, which bounced him back like a rubber ball. "Oops." Ethan mumbled as the class erupted into gasps and shrieks. His limbs flailed comically in the gravity-free environment as he tried to steady himself. Professor Zarn's eye stalks quivered with excitement. "Look at this." Even under high radiation stress, the Deathworlders' muscle control is still functional. Remarkable resilience. Suddenly, the bubble shifted, and Ethan felt the tingling sensation ease as the radiation exposure was dialed down. His skin, though slightly red, seemed to return to normal. "Well, that wasn't fun," Ethan groaned, wiping sweat from his brow. "But I'm still in one piece, I think." Professor Zarn waved his tentacles excitedly. "Excellent, excellent. Class, take notes. This ability to absorb and adapt to radiation could prove invaluable in space exploration. Let's proceed to the next scenario." Before Ethan could protest, the bubble began to glow again, this time shifting into a bright red as the artificial gravity inside the bubble suddenly cranked up to extreme levels. Ethan felt a crushing force pressing down on him, and he grunted in pain. "This is intense," Ethan wheezed, his knees buckling under the pressure. Despite the weight, Ethan's muscles strained, but he began to slowly straighten, his face red from exertion. The class watched in awe as he took one shaky step, then another, adapting to the intense gravitational pull. "Remarkable," Professor Zarn exclaimed. "His body is actively reinforcing itself in real time." Deathworlders are truly marvels of adaptation. Just as Ethan found his balance, a loud crack echoed through the room. The floor beneath him collapsed under the strain, and the bubble along with Ethan plummeted through to the classroom below. Pandemonium erupted as students rushed to the edge, peering through the hole to see what had become of Ethan. Through the dust, they saw the bubble intact, with Ethan lying at the center, groaning in pain but smiling. "A little help down here," Ethan called up weakly. "I think I just created an impromptu basement level." The class burst into laughter, and Professor Zarn's gelatinous form quivered with excitement. "Class, it appears we have yet another unexpected experiment to analyze impact resistance. Quickly, take notes." As Ethan was levitated back into the classroom, along with some very disgruntled debris from the lower level, the students continued to watch in fascination. Ethan, though battered, seemed mostly unharmed, and even managed a grin. Gorp, regaining his courage, sneered. "So, Deathworlder, how'd that feel? Still think you're invincible?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his sore arms. "Not invincible," he said with a grin, "but definitely bouncy. I believe we've gathered sufficient data from the radiation and gravitational stress tests," Professor Zarn said with barely contained glee, his gelatinous form vibrating slightly. "But now, let us move on to the next phase, an atmospheric anomaly simulation." Ethan's eyes widened in panic as the bubble around him started to hum. He was still sore from the gravitational stress experiment, and the words anomaly didn't sound particularly comforting. "Professor, I'm not sure I'm ready for," Ethan began, but it was too late. The air inside the bubble suddenly began to thin, and he felt the familiar sensation of being in a vacuum, much like during his anti-gravity training at space camp. Except this time, the stakes were real. His cheeks puffed out like a chipmunk's as the pressure dropped, and his breathing became shallow. His voice, now high-pitched and squeaky, echoed through the bubble. "Okay, now I really can't breathe." The class watched in silent fascination, their eye stalks, tentacles, and other appendages locked onto Ethan as he flailed around, trying to ground himself in the thinning atmosphere. Gorp, never one to let an opportunity slip by, grinned. "Hey Ethan, you look like a space balloon that's about to pop," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Professor Zarn, however, was too engrossed in the experiment to notice. "Look how his body is reacting," he said, his eye stalks flicking back and forth between Ethan and the monitor displaying his vitals. The human's physiology is compensating for the lack of pressure at an astonishing rate. He's maintaining cognitive function despite the extreme vacuum. Ethan, floating helplessly, managed to shoot Gorp a withering glare, though in his current state, it came off more comical than threatening. "You. No." Gorp, he gasped, his breath coming in short, thin puffs. "We humans have a saying back on Earth. I'd rather be a deflated space balloon than a," he paused, struggling for air, "than a, whatever it is you are." The class broke into a mix of nervous laughter and chirps, while Gorp scowled. Before the taunting could escalate, the bubble's atmosphere stabilized, and Ethan dropped unceremoniously to the floor inside the force field. "Ow," Ethan groaned, rubbing his head. "Okay, I'm still alive. But seriously, Professor, can we dial back the death-defying experiments just a bit?" Professor Zarn gave a gentle wobble that Ethan had come to recognize as the alien equivalent of a chuckle. "I'm afraid, Mr. Ryder, that we have only just begun. Your resilience is far too valuable for us to stop now." Before Ethan could protest, the professor raised a tentacle, signaling the start of the next scenario. "Computer, prepare for Scenario 3 adaptive reflexes in unstable terrain. Unstable what now?" Ethan mumbled, but he didn't get an answer. Instead, the bubble's floor began to tremble beneath him. His legs wobbled, and he quickly realized that the ground beneath his feet was moving not violently, but unpredictably. One moment, it sloped upward. The next, it dipped into a crater-like depression. The ground inside the bubble has been programmed to simulate the erratic surface conditions of several hazardous planets, Professor Zarn explained, his voice taking on that same mad scientist enthusiasm. "Let's see how you handle sudden changes in terrain, Mr. Ryder." Ethan staggered as the bubble floor tilted wildly beneath him, forcing him to hop from foot to foot, doing his best not to faceplant into the undulating surface. "Ho, whoa, whoa, ho. This is like trying to walk on a funhouse floor at a carnival," Ethan exclaimed, waving his arms for balance. The aliens in the room watched, fascinated by how quickly he adapted. Even though to Ethan it felt more like a desperate struggle than an adaptation. "Fascinating," Professor Zarn beamed. "The human body's ability to adjust to these shifts in balance is extraordinary. Look at how his muscular responses keep him from toppling, even in chaotic conditions." Gorp, unable to resist, threw in another taunt. "More like chaotic dancing. You should call this the Deathworld Shuffle, hey." Ethan grimaced but managed to stay on his feet. "Oh, you'll be dancing soon enough when you're next in line for one of these experiments," Gorp, he grumbled, barely managing to sidestep a particularly deep dip in the ground. Just as he thought he had found his footing, the bubble's surface suddenly flattened out and then shot upward, flinging Ethan into the air. He crashed back down in an ungraceful heap, much to the amusement of the class. "I think I'm done," Ethan groaned, lying flat on the bubble floor, trying to catch his breath. His head swam, and his muscles ached from the sudden movements. Professor Zarn seemed oblivious to Ethan's exhaustion. "What an incredible demonstration of Deathworlder adaptability," he announced, turning to the class. "We now know that humans are capable of navigating erratic terrain under extreme environmental stresses. Truly remarkable." Ethan, still flat on the floor, raised a hand weakly. "Glad I could help, Professor. But seriously, can I lie down for a bit now? Maybe just a nap in a bubble that isn't trying to kill me." Before Zarn could respond, the classroom door swished open again. This time, Chef Glaxer oozed in, his translucent body flashing with a series of angry hues. His gelatinous appendages waved furiously as he glared at Ethan. "No more experiments in the cafeteria," Glaxer shouted, his body vibrating with indignation. "You, Deathworlder, you caused enough trouble with the plasma jelly. Now, you think you can just take food and not blow up entire cafeterias?" Ethan groaned. "Great, now I'm banned from the cafeteria too." As if the situation couldn't get any worse, the professor's voice broke in once more. "Oh, don't worry, Mr. Ryder. You won't have to worry about that for long. Class, it appears we've completed our terrestrial tests, And now we will proceed to a much more exciting experiment: extreme cosmic environments. Ethan's head shot up, eyes wide with panic. Wait, what cosmic environments? You're not seriously. Before he could finish, the classroom floor gave way again, dropping Ethan into a simulated vacuum chamber below. As he tumbled into yet another high-risk test, his voice echoed back up to the students above. I swear, if I survive this, I'm transferring to a nice, boring planet where gravity is optional. The class leaned over the edge, watching with awe as Ethan once again faced the unknown. Even Gorp, the relentless troublemaker, had to admit being a Deathworlder came with more than just a tough exterior. It took guts, luck, and apparently a very high pain tolerance. Well, Gorp, a classmate, murmured, tentacles twitching in thought, I guess you were right. Deathworlders are pretty squishy, but maybe that's what makes them so hard to break. As Professor Xylox Zarn prepared to log his next set of observations, a faint smile played across his otherwise gelatinous form. No matter what happened next, one thing was clear: the future of Galactic University's Deathworlder Studies program was going to be anything but boring. The simulated vacuum chamber Ethan had fallen into whirred to life, and the atmosphere seemed to vanish entirely. Ethan floated helplessly, trying to find a grip on something, anything, but his hands only brushed against smooth, frictionless walls. This is just getting ridiculous, he muttered, his voice thin in the vacuum. He was still reeling from the last experiment, and now he was trapped in yet another death-defying simulation. Oxygen levels were low, his chest felt tight, and he was seriously beginning to regret ever signing up for this exchange program. Above him, Professor Xylox Zarn observed from the safety of the main classroom, his eye stalks focused intently on the data streaming in. Now, class, this is where things get particularly interesting, Zarn announced, waving his tentacles with excitement. We've placed Mr. Ryder in a near-vacuum state. Let's see how long a Deathworlder can maintain consciousness under these conditions. The class peered down into the chamber, through the observation windows, fascinated by Ethan's predicament. Even Gorp, for all his usual bravado, was strangely silent, his tentacles tightly wrapped around himself as he watched. Inside the vacuum chamber, Ethan's breath came in shallow, gasping bursts. His thoughts were foggy, and he felt the creeping numbness of hypoxia setting in. Okay, gotta stay calm, he muttered to himself, his eyes darting around for a way out. Just another crazy experiment. I've survived worse, I think. But then, as his vision blurred and his consciousness began to fade, something unexpected happened. A low hum filled the chamber as the force field flickered and a soft, warm light enveloped Ethan. The pressure returned to normal, and he fell ungracefully to the chamber floor with a loud thud. What the Ethan mumbled, rubbing his head as he regained his senses. He looked around, confused, and then realized that the force field had deactivated. He was back in breathable air, though a bit dazed. Above, Professor Zarn's eye stalks twitched erratically in confusion. Computer, explain the interruption, he demanded, but the response from the AI was simply a series of distorted beeps. Something was wrong with the simulation. The experiment hadn't ended because of human adaptability, it had been interrupted. Suddenly, the entire classroom shook. A deep, reverberating rumble echoed through the walls of Galactic University, and the overhead lights flickered. The students, previously engrossed in the experiment, began to murmur nervously. Professor, what was that? Gorp asked, his usual snark replaced with genuine concern. Professor Zarn's tentacles stilled, and his normally jovial expression shifted to something far more serious. This wasn't part of the lesson plan, he admitted, his eye stalks swiveling around the room as the vibrations grew stronger. Everyone remain calm. We may be experiencing some unexpected interference. Before anyone could react, the classroom doors burst open and Professor Lornak Drex, the cosmic botany instructor, rushed in, his branch-like limbs rustling with urgency. Xylox, he shouted, his normally composed voice laced with panic. The planetary core is destabilizing. "There's a malfunction in the gravity regulators. It's affecting the entire campus," the class gasped in unison, and Professor Zarn's gelatinous form turned a deep shade of blue, the color of worry. "A malfunction? How could that? There's no time," Drex interrupted, shaking his leaf-like appendages. "We have to evacuate immediately. If we don't fix the regulators, the gravitational shifts could collapse the entire campus." Ethan, still dazed from his ordeal in the vacuum chamber, stumbled to his feet, catching only fragments of the frantic conversation above him. "Wait, did someone say the campus is going to collapse?" he asked, his eyes wide. "That seems bad." Professor Zarn, clearly flustered but attempting to regain control, snapped into action. "Class, this is now an emergency situation. Everyone, remain calm and proceed to the nearest evacuation zone. Mr. Ryder, you two, no more tests today." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He quickly scrambled out of the malfunctioning chamber and joined the flood of students rushing toward the exits. But as he made his way toward the door, Gorp, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, sidled up beside him. "So, Deathworlder, any bright ideas on how we're going to survive a gravitational collapse?" Gorp asked, his tone a mixture of sarcasm and genuine fear. Ethan grimaced. "Survive? I've barely survived class today. But if you're asking for a plan, well, I guess it's time to wing it." The rumbling grew more intense as the group raced down the hallways. Professor Drex's warning echoed in Ethan's mind. The planetary core was destabilizing, and if they didn't fix the regulators, the entire campus could be destroyed. "This is crazy," Ethan muttered to himself. This was supposed to be an exchange program, not an intergalactic death trap. As the students neared the evacuation zones, the shaking suddenly stopped. Silence fell over the group, and for a moment they all exchanged confused looks. "Is it over?" Gorp asked, his eye stalks twitching nervously. Ethan frowned, scanning the surroundings. "I don't think so. It feels more like." The calm before the storm. Before anyone could respond, a deafening boom echoed through the building, and the floor beneath them buckled. Suddenly, the gravitational pull intensified dramatically, pinning everyone to the floor. "We're not going to make it," one of the students cried out, their voice muffled by the crushing force. Ethan, his body straining under the intense gravity, forced himself to look around. The walls were cracking, the lights were flickering, and the hum of the malfunctioning regulators filled the air. "This is bad," Ethan muttered, his voice strained. "Really, really bad." And then, as if the universe had decided to give him one last impossible challenge, Ethan remembered something. Something ridiculous. Something that just might save them. With all the strength he could muster, he turned to Professor Zarn, who was struggling under the same crushing force. "Professor, those gravity regulators, do they have a manual override?" Zarn's eye stalks flickered in confusion. "A manual override? Why, yes, but only in extreme." "This feels pretty extreme to me," Ethan gasped, pushing against the gravity and pointing toward the control room at the far end of the hallway. "We have to get to the override." Gorp, still struggling beside him, groaned. "You've got to be kidding me. You want us to crawl all the way down there?" In this, Ethan managed a weak grin. "Got a better idea," Gorp sighed, clearly regretting every decision that led him to this moment. "Fine. Let's do this." With great effort, Ethan, Gorp, and the rest of the class began to inch their way toward the control room. The gravitational force was nearly unbearable, but somehow, Ethan's Deathworlder physiology, his resilience kicked in. With each painstaking movement, he felt his muscles adapting to the intense pressure. "We can do this," Ethan grunted, leading the way. "Just keep moving." The class followed, each step a struggle, but with Ethan at the front, they made progress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the control panel. Professor Zarn, his form practically flattened by the gravitational force, managed to raise a tentacle and press a series of buttons. The gravity regulator began to hum loudly, its lights flashing red, and then silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the gravity returned to normal, and the pressure lifted. Everyone collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, but alive. "We did it," Ethan whispered, staring up at the ceiling, completely exhausted. "We actually did it," Gorp, lying beside him, groaned. "You're insane, Ryder." "But I guess you're not so bad," Ethan laughed weakly. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment." As the class slowly recovered, Professor Zarn wobbled over, his form flickering between colors of relief and pride. "Well, class, I must say, that was an unexpected turn of events. But once again, Mr. Ryder, your Deathworlder resilience has proven invaluable." Ethan grinned, though he was too tired to move. "Yeah, well, I think I'll need a long break before the next practical demonstration, Professor." Professor Zarn's eye stalks twitched. "Oh, I assure you, Mr. Ryder, the next one will be far less eventful." Gorp snorted. "I'll believe that when I see it." As the class slowly made their way back to their feet, Ethan glanced around at his alien classmates, at the wreckage left behind from the gravitational malfunction, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. He had survived yet another chaotic day at Galactic University, and somehow he had done it with a little help from his new friends. "Well," Ethan said, standing up and dusting himself off, "I guess being a Deathworlder isn't so bad after all." If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says, we will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.